the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
When was the last time you actually wrote a letter to someone? With email, texting, and all the different forms of social media that people use today, letter writing has become a lost art. But as most of you know, there was a time when people actually used letters as one of the main forms in communication. I ran across this letter on the internet the other day. Hilarion to his sister, wife, Alice. Very many greetings to my respected Beerus and Apollinarian. Know that we are still at this moment in Alexandria. Don't be anxious if all of them return, and I stay in Alexandria. I ask you and urge you, look after the child, and as soon as I receive my pay, I will send it to you. If by chance you give birth, and it is a male, let it live. If it is a female, get rid of it. You said to Aphrodosius, don't forget me. How can I forget you? I ask you therefore, do not be anxious at all. As we read this short letter, we are immediately struck by a few of the details, such as him referring to his wife as his sister, or talk of giving birth and what to do with the baby, depending on the gender of the baby. The truth of the matter is, to borrow a phrase from theologian Marcus Borg, we are reading someone else's mail. And so a lot of the details that probably seem out of place or just seem wrong to us surely seem very normal to its intended recipients. Now, if we want to better understand the letter, we would need to ask several questions so that we might learn about its context, into which it was written, and why it was written. And so in asking the questions, we learned that this letter was written in 1 CE in Egypt, and Hilarion was the husband of a pregnant woman named Alice, who was not his sister. Egyptians used to use words like brothers and sisters as terms of endearment when addressing their spouses, leading some early 19th century Egyptologists to speak of brother-sister marriages. But we now know that while first cousin marriages were not very uncommon, anything closer was as unacceptable then as it would be today. Further, Hilarion had gone to Alexandria because there was a job waiting for him there, and so his hope was to make some money and send it back to his family. Now, the most difficult part of the letter is when he talks about the baby that is to be born. Unfortunately, newborn abandonment was common in the ancient pagan world, and while women were treated better in ancient Egypt than in most places, this kind of thing still happened, especially to female babies. And so his request, while bothersome to us, was probably not unexpected. Now, when we look at the letters of Paul, we are once again reading someone else's mail. Paul was not writing to us, but instead he was writing to specific churches and communities, and in one instance to an individual named Philemon. And in each case he was writing to give encouragement or advice, but also to talk about specific events that happened 2,000 years ago. And so when we read his letters, we must begin by trying to understand how the original audience would have heard them. What is the context into which he was writing? And once we understand that context, then we can ask, what do these words mean to us today? Talking about words from the past, tomorrow is the 4th of July. And so I got to thinking of those all too famous words from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, all people, are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All people are created equal. Turning to our New Testament lesson for this morning, Paul was imprisoned in Rome, but on account of his age, or maybe on account of good behavior, the apostle was allowed to live in his own home and he was chained to a soldier during this time. And while under house arrest, he was able to receive visitors. One of these visitors turned out to be a runaway slave named Onesimus, whose master was Philemon. Now, we don't know what line of work Philemon was in, but he was now serving as a pastor, having been converted to Christianity by Paul. Philemon had a wife named Apphia and a son named Archippus, and they were very wealthy. And as part of their wealth, they owned many slaves. And as I said, Onesimus was one of them. Now it appears that Onesimus had stolen something from Philemon, and he had fled for his life. And knowing that Colossae, where they lived, was a small town, and a fugitive from the law could not stay there unprotected or undetected, he decided to go to Rome. Once in Rome, we don't know if he sought Paul out, or if someone else brought him to Paul, or if it was just a chance meeting. But no matter, once he got to Rome, he and Paul spent a great deal of time together. And Onesimus, like his master, is converted to Christianity. So Paul, knowing his story, and also knowing Philemon very well, decides to write a letter to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus. And he begins his letter with a nice greeting, where he praises Philemon for all the work that he's been doing for Christ, and for his faith, and for all that he has shared with others. But then he quickly turns to the real reason for this letter. He wants to talk about Onesimus. Paul tells Philemon that he could demand that Onesimus be set free, but he realizes this would not be right. Instead, he wants to send Onesimus back to Philemon, that he might receive, not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ, and that they would work together for the mission of God, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with all around them. The movie begins with a man named Sinkin struggling to remove a nail from the floor of a ship using only his fingers. When he finally removes the nail, his hands are all bloody, but he is then able to take the nail and free himself from the chains that are bound to his wrists and his ankles. Once he is free, he goes around and frees the others from their chains. And once they are all free, they kill their captives and take over the ship. The movie Amistad is based on the true story of the 1839 mutiny aboard the slave ship La Amistad. After freeing themselves and killing their captives, they try to sail back to Africa, but they are unable, and instead their ship is spotted by an American Navy ship who arrest them for piracy and murder. This, however, leads to an international legal battle with several people and countries arguing that these men and the ship belong to them. But a lawyer from the United States named Robert Sherman Baldwin is hired to defend them and fight for their freedom. Now, you and I know how poorly slaves can be treated. And while in the first century they were typically treated much better than they were in the South or during this time, but still we know that slavery was a dreadful thing. And so we might be confused as to why Paul does not demand Onesimus and all of Philemon's slaves to be set free immediately. We want Paul to condemn the practice of slavery right then and there when he has the opportunity. But instead, he gives Philemon a choice. He gives Philemon the opportunity and asks him how he will proceed with this slave who is stolen from him. The reality is that Paul was asking Philemon more than to simply set Onesimus free. Paul was asking Philemon to change his way of thinking. Paul wants Philemon to accept one of his slaves as a brother in Christ. In other words, not just to set him free, but to change their relationship. The old relationship of master and slave was to be absorbed into a new one as brothers in Christ. So what do you think of this request? This was radical thinking for the first century, as it completely overturned the traditional values of that society. The Roman Empire was built on slave labor. There were no bulldozers or cranes or tractors to help with the work that needed to be done. And so roads, buildings, ships, they were all built by the hands of people. They were all built by the hands of slaves. And if you're a farmer, you did it all your own work, or you had slaves that did the work for you. In fact, slavery was such an important part of the Roman society that it was said that they often went to battle for no other reason than to gain more slaves. And so even if Paul condemned the practice of slavery and tried to defy the corrupt society of the time, where slavery was seen as a natural state of some human beings, things weren't going to change. Knowing this, Paul chooses instead to simply ignore the boundaries between slaves and masters and to treat them as if they didn't exist at all. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, which we will begin to look at next week, Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So back to our movie. In the courts, it was determined that the homicide slaves were not slaves,